Welcome to the Cheating Wife Stories channel. I wasn't meant to hear it, but I did. It was supposed to be just another night at my in-laws' house. Predictable, dull, the usual routine where everyone pretended we were the perfect family. I had stepped out of the kitchen, making my way back to the living room, when I heard my wife's voice. She was speaking in a hushed tone, low enough that she thought no one else could hear. But I did. "He's a joke in bed, Mom. I swear I have to fake it every time." Then came the laughter. My mother-in-law's laughter, a sharp, knowing chuckle, like this was some inside joke between them. It wasn't just amusement. There was ridicule in it, a kind of condescending amusement that made my stomach turn. I stopped mid-step, frozen in place, my brain scrambling to process what I had just heard. The world around me faded, the sounds in the house dulling under the weight of those words. I tightened around the cold glass of water in my hand, but I didn't move, didn't breathe too loudly, afraid they'd realize I was standing just around the corner. I should have barged in, should have confronted her right then and there. But I didn't, not because I was afraid of a fight, but because something told me this moment was bigger than just an argument. This was the kind of moment that changes everything. The kind you can't come back from. I listened. "Oh, honey, that's just how men are," my mother-in-law said in a dismissive tone, as if I were some unfortunate burden her daughter had to endure. "At least he's good for other things, right?" Another chuckle. Another wave of disgust washing over me. I had never thought much about my relationship with my mother-in-law before. She had always been a little cold toward me, a little condescending. But I assumed it was just her personality. I had told myself it didn't matter. She wasn't the one I married. But now, standing there, invisible to them, hearing them talk about me like I was some pitiful excuse for a man, it became painfully clear. This wasn't just a slip of the tongue. It wasn't just a careless joke. This was how they saw me, less than. I felt something shift inside me, a realization, a quiet but definitive understanding that the marriage I had been holding on to, the one I had put effort into, meant something entirely different to her, to them. I backed away, moving silently toward the bathroom, locking the door behind me as I set the glass of water down on the counter. My reflection stared back at me in the mirror, my expression blank, but my mind was racing. How long had she felt this way? Had it always been like this? I started replaying moments from our marriage, little comments she had made over the years that I had brushed off. The night she had turned away without a word, the time she seemed impatient, the way she sometimes rolled her eyes when I initiated anything intimate. I had always assumed it was stress, fatigue, life getting in the way. But now I wondered, had she ever truly wanted me, or had I been fooling myself all along? A joke. That word stuck with me the most. I wasn't hurt in the way she might have expected if she ever thought I would hear her. No, this was something else. A slow, creeping anger mixed with a strange sense of clarity. I wasn't devastated. I wasn't broken. I was just done. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. There was no need to storm out of the bathroom. No need for a dramatic confrontation. Not yet, because this wasn't just about that one moment. It was about everything. For the first time in a long time, I stopped looking at my marriage through the lens of someone desperately trying to fix it. Instead, I saw it for what it truly was, and I knew right then and there that things were about to change. I walked out of that bathroom like nothing had happened, not because I was okay, far from it, but because I needed time to process, to observe, to see everything for what it truly was. When I stepped back into the living room, my wife and her mother were still seated on the couch, sipping wine, laughing at something else now, as if their little moment of mockery had never happened. But I saw it differently. I saw them differently. I took my usual seat across from them, and for the first time I wasn't just existing in that space. I was studying it. My wife glanced at me briefly, her expression unreadable, then turned her attention back to her mother. She didn't seem the least bit guilty or concerned. That's what got to me the most. No awkward glances, no second guessing if I had overheard anything. Because in her mind, it wasn't even a possibility. That's how little she thought of me. She was so sure that I was just some oblivious fool, too blind to ever catch on. I watched them talk, their voices blurring into background noise as I started seeing things I had ignored for years. The way her mother always spoke to her in a way that put me in a lesser position. The way my wife agreed, nodded, laughed at comments that diminished me, as if I wasn't even in the room. I wasn't angry, not in the way I thought I would be. No outburst, no clenched fists, just stillness. A quiet kind of realization that settled deep inside me. She had never respected me. The ride home was silent. My wife scrolled through her phone, occasionally letting out a small laugh at whatever was on her screen, completely indifferent to the man sitting next to her. And for the first time, I saw that silence for what it truly was. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't familiarity. It was indifference. She didn't ask if something was wrong. She didn't glance at me to check if I was okay. And that told me everything I needed to know. When we got home, she went straight to the bedroom, changing into her usual oversized t-shirt and settling into bed with her phone in hand. That was her routine. I had seen it 100 times before, but tonight, I wasn't just watching. I was understanding. I sat on the edge of the bed, looking at her, not with love, not with anger, just clarity. "Did you have a good time tonight?" I asked. She barely looked up. "Yeah, it was nice." "Nice." I nodded, staring at the floor for a moment. Then I asked something I had never asked before, something that felt so simple, yet carried so much weight. "Do you respect me?" That got her attention. Her fingers still on the phone screen, and she finally looked up. Not with guilt, not with concern, just confusion. Like the question itself was foreign to her. "What?" She let out a short, humorless laugh. "What kind of question is that?" "A serious one." Her brows furrowed. "Of course I respect you." But there was no conviction in her tone, no weight behind the words. It was automatic, dismissive, like she was checking a box. I didn't press further, because I already knew the answer. She went back to her phone, and I just sat there, absorbing the moment. The way she had no curiosity about why I was asking. The way she had no desire to reassure me. That night I didn't sleep much. Not because I was upset, but because my mind was already working through what needed to be done next. I had spent so much time trying to be a good husband, trying to make things work, trying to be someone she could love and respect. But you can't force someone to value you, and for the first time in years, I finally understood. I was done trying. The next morning, I woke up before my wife. I sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, listening to the quiet hum of the ceiling fan. My mind was clear, too clear. It wasn't the usual grogginess that came with mornings. It was something else, something sharper. I glanced over at her. She was curled up under the blankets, her face slack and deep sleep. Peaceful, comfortable, completely unaware that everything had shifted. I got up, walked to the bathroom, and shut the door behind me. I didn't turn on the light at first. I just stood there in the dim morning glow, feeling the cold tile under my feet. Then finally, I looked at myself in the mirror. For the first time in a long time, I really looked. Not just at my reflection, but at who I had become. I saw the exhaustion in my eyes, the dullness in them, that I had convinced myself was just part of being an adult, of being married. The slight hunch in my shoulders, the way my face had lost the expression of someone who enjoyed life. This wasn't who I used to be. I used to have confidence. I used to have presence. I used to matter. At least to myself. When had that changed? I leaned against the sink, gripping the edges tightly. My mind started replaying things I had long buried, things I had excused, ignored, or simply accepted. The way my wife always had the final say on everything. Where we ate, what vacations we took, who we spent time with, the way she rolled her eyes when I spoke about my interests, as if they were beneath her. The way I had slowly, almost imperceptibly, stopped talking about things I loved because I knew she didn't care. Then there were the things I did just to keep the peace, apologizing for things I didn't do, laughing off comments that stung, letting her mother's insults slide because that's just how she is, swallowing my frustration when she dismissed me in front of friends, or worse, when she made jokes at my expense while they laughed along. I had been convincing myself for years that this was normal, that this was just marriage, that love meant compromise. But this wasn't compromise, it was erasure. I straightened up, staring hard at my reflection. I wasn't angry. Not at her. Not anymore. I was angry at me, for letting it get this far, for allowing myself to become a version of me that accepted being treated like an afterthought. I thought back to the night before, to her dismissive answer when I asked if she respected me, to how quickly she had brushed off the question, like it wasn't even worth discussing. The truth was, she didn't respect me. But the real truth, I didn't respect myself. That realization hit harder than anything else. I let out a slow breath, gripping the sink even tighter. This wasn't just about her anymore. This wasn't just about a marriage that had lost its foundation. This was about me, who I had become, who I wanted to be, and whether I was willing to keep living in a reality where I had to beg for basic dignity. No, not anymore. I turned on the faucet, splashing cold water on my face, letting it ground me. I wasn't going to waste another second pretending that things would change, pretending that if I just tried harder, she would suddenly see my worth. I had seen enough. And now it was time for her to see what it felt like when I stopped trying. When I stepped out of the bathroom, I felt different, not in an obvious way, not in a way that my wife would notice immediately, but in a way that I felt deep in my bones. I didn't say anything as I walked past her, still wrapped in the blankets, half awake, and scrolling through her phone. I used to say, "Good morning," every day, used to kiss her forehead before starting my routine. Not today. And she didn't notice. I grabbed my keys, walked out the door, and got into my car. I wasn't going to work just yet. I needed time. I drove without a destination, letting my thoughts settle, organizing the pieces of what was coming next. I wasn't going to act on emotion. I refused to give her that satisfaction. No impulsive arguments. No desperate pleas. That wasn't who I was anymore. I had already spent too long waiting for something to change. Now I was going to be the one who changed things. When I got home that evening, I kept my energy neutral. I wasn't cold, but I wasn't there either. She was in the kitchen talking on the phone with her mother. Her laughter was light, effortless, completely unaware of the shift that had already begun. I grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, listening. No, he hasn't said anything. Same as always. You know how he is. The way she said it, the certainty in her tone, like I was predictable, like she knew exactly how I would react, or rather, how I wouldn't. I could feel her mother's smugness through the phone. Men are simple, sweetheart. As long as you keep his routine the same, he won't even think about it. I didn't flinch. I didn't make a sound. I just walked away, because that was the last time she would ever think she knew who I was. After the next few days, I did what I had never done before. I stopped playing the game. I didn't text her throughout the day like I usually did. No "how's your day going?" No pointless check-ins. Nothing. I started coming home later, not with excuses, not with lies, just later. And when I did, I wasn't angry. I wasn't cold. I was just distant. When she asked, "Where were you?" I answered simply, "Out." And that was it. She wasn't used to that. She was used to control, to knowing every little detail, to having me as this steady, predictable presence in her life. But now there was a version of me she didn't recognize. She started watching me more, paying attention, trying to figure out what had changed. "Are you okay?" she asked one night, finally catching on to the shift. I looked at her. really looked at her. I saw her confusion, her insecurity, her discomfort. Good. For years I had been the one questioning, the one adjusting to fit into her world. Now she was the one searching for answers. "I'm fine," I said, voice even. And I let her sit in the silence. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. She started making little comments, trying to provoke a reaction. "You've been really quiet lately," I shrugged. "You're acting weird." Another shrug. She couldn't stand it. Because silence, indifference, that was power. And for the first time in our marriage, I was the one holding it. She started calling me more throughout the day, leaving little notes around the house, something she hadn't done in years. She even made my favorite dinner one night, setting the table like we were newlyweds again. I sat down, took a bite, and nodded. "It's good." That was all I said. She knew something was wrong. She wasn't stupid, manipulative, selfish, dismissive, yes, but not stupid. She felt a shift. She saw it in the way I didn't react the way I used to, in the way I stopped chasing, in the way I no longer asked about her day, no longer sought her out for conversation, no longer tried to fix the gaps between us. And that terrified her, because for the first time she wasn't in control. The night it all came to a head, she was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, pretending not to care. But I saw the tension in her posture, the way she barely looked at the screen. She was waiting, waiting for me to ask what was wrong, waiting for me to try and pull her back in. I sat down across from her, silent for a moment. Then calmly I said, "I heard you." She blinked, confused. "What?" I leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on my knees. "That night at your mother's house. I heard you." Her face paled. Just for a second. Just long enough for me to see the panic flash in her eyes before she masked it with a nervous laugh. "What? What are you talking about?" I didn't repeat myself. I didn't need to. Her hands tightened around her phone. "Look, if you misheard something, I didn't." My voice was even. Steady. No anger. No emotion. Just facts. "I heard exactly what you said. You called me a joke in bed. You told your mother you fake it every time." I tilted my head, and she laughed. "You laughed. So tell me, what part of that did I mishear?" She sat there stunned, mouth slightly open, trying to process the fact that I wasn't playing along this time, that I wasn't going to let her talk her way out of this. "You," she started, then exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You're seriously upset about that?" It was just girl talk. It wasn't even that deep. I almost laughed. "Not that deep." I nodded slowly as if considering her words. "Interesting," she frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" I leaned back, stretching out my legs, watching her closely. "It means I'd finally understand something." She crossed her arms, defensive now. "Oh yeah? And what's that?" I met her eyes, completely calm. "That I'm done." Silence. She stared at me, blinking rapidly, as if the words didn't compute. "Done with what?" she asked, her voice suddenly smaller than before. I gestured vaguely between us. "This, us, whatever you want to call it." She let out a forced, nervous laugh. "You're being ridiculous." "Am I?" I tilted my head. "Because for years I've been blind to the way you see me. I let things slide. I made excuses for you. Hell, I convinced myself that your lack of effort, your lack of interest, was just how marriage worked. But it's not. Your marriage is supposed to be respect. And I see now that you don't respect me. You probably never have." She shifted, swallowing hard. "That's not true." "Really?" I smiled slightly. "And why didn't you seem even the slightest bit guilty when you said it? Why didn't you hesitate before laughing with your mother about me?" Her mouth opened, then closed. She had nothing. I stood up, stretching slightly, feeling lighter than I had in years. "I don't hate you," I said honestly. "But I also don't love you anymore. Not in the way a husband should love his wife. And definitely not in the way a man should love someone who doesn't respect him." Her breathing quickened. "Wait." I already made arrangements. I slipped my phone out of my pocket and placed it on the table. On the screen was a forwarded email, the lease to a new apartment. Signed, her lips parted in shock. You planned this. I nodded. Yeah, a while ago. That's when the panic set in. She had spent years believing she had all the power in this relationship, believing that she could say and do whatever she wanted. And I'd always be there, willing to forgive, willing to chase after her. But now I was walking away. Now she was the one scrambling. You're serious? She asked, voice unsteady. Completely. She stared at me, realization settling in. You don't love me anymore. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. I shook my head. No. And for the first time since I had met her, she was the one who looked small. She didn't cry. I think a part of me expected her to, or at least to put on some kind of show. But she just sat there staring at me, processing the fact that I wasn't bluffing. That this wasn't one of our usual disagreements where I'd get frustrated. She'd roll her eyes, and then we'd move on like nothing happened. No, this was different, because I was already gone. I picked up my phone from the table, slipped it back into my pocket, and walked toward the bedroom. I could feel her watching me, but she didn't say a word. Not when I grabbed the bag I had packed days ago. Not when I took my keys. Not when I stepped toward the door. I stopped just short of leaving, turned back to look at her one last time. She looked small, not in a pitiful way, not in a way that made me feel sorry for her, just small, like someone who had spent her entire life believing that she was in control, only to realize too late that she never was. I hope you find whatever it is you actually want, I said, and I meant it. She didn't respond. I walked out the door, and just like that it was over. There's something surreal about driving away from a life you once thought was permanent. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel angry. I just felt light. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of trying to prove my worth to someone who had never valued it in the first place. I didn't have to explain myself anymore. I didn't have to wonder if I was good enough. I didn't have to try. And that realization, it was liberating. My new apartment was nothing special, just a simple one-bedroom, bare walls, minimal furniture. But when I walked inside, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. There was no tension lingering in the air. No silent judgments. No walking on eggshells, second-guessing every word, every action, wondering if I was doing something wrong. Just silence and freedom. The first night I sat on my new couch with a beer in hand, staring out the window at the city lights. And I thought about everything. About how much time I had wasted. About how many years I had spent shrinking myself down, making myself smaller to fit into a life that was never meant for me. And then I stopped thinking. Because the past didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what came next. The funny thing about letting go is that once you do, you realize how easy it actually is. You spend so much time clinging to something because you think you need it, because you convince yourself that without it, you'll fall apart. But then you let go and you don't fall apart. You breathe, you move forward, and you never look back.